I want to thank everyone for coming to this Science of Aging discussion wrap-up hosted by Whole Brain Health, an event in association with Science Circle. It was a series of discussions over the summer, which were a curated batch of YouTube talks that we watched and discussed, and really wanted to get to bringing together a discussion of some of the modern understanding and the science of the aging process, but with a little bit more of an emphasis on what you can do in terms of lifestyle that can actually help with that. So the format of it was to have this be as much of an open discussion as possible. So that's also going to be true today, and that's the structure of today, as I will give a review and summary of the videos, because not everyone can make all of those events. And then we'll have some posed questions by myself, and then really an open discussion about some of the science of aging, what it means for us individually, and potentially, I think, some interesting conversation about what it means for us as a society. So with that, my interest in the science of aging came from some historical reasons from my old research. And I decided to give a talk for Whole Brain Health as a part of the Ageless Mind project. And I want to just give the quick summary upshot of that talk, which was this understanding that at the cellular level, there are things that contribute to the organism aging. And what seemed to be, in terms of our modern understanding of that, is that genomic instability, again, DNA getting damaged, DNA getting repaired is a part of that process. Inflammation, again, these intracellular processes that relate to our response, what is our immune response to pathogens, is also something that can drive aging of cells. And then something that is this loss of theory, where the loss of information theory, or the loss of cellular identity that contributes. And that these all feed back on each other. Once you have one of these driving forward within a cellular population, they can actually drive and become a positive feedback loop for a continuing process that leads to cellular aging. And what I really wanted to do for the summer was to get to this other question. Again, this is something that is clearly in line with what whole brain health is all about. And that is understanding this outside contextual influence on our bodies. And so I'm dividing this into three main categories that we understand, which is diet. Again, one of the key things of an organism is the ability to take in nutrients, take in energy, and that influences our health, in particular, in certain ways in aging, we now know. What are energy balances? So a lot of the interesting science that's been driving forward is understanding how energy balance, again, our body sensing, say, starvation or low calories versus high calories, can actually influence a lot that happens in terms of aging. And of course, we have choices in terms of how many calories can be consumed. And then I'm also making a grab bag of other chemistry. And this other chemistry can be things like environmental contaminants, could be things like UV light that relate to the chemistry of the body. And in some cases, we choose to take specific hormones. But a lot of what happens in terms of the chemistry of our body, and this includes diet, this includes our energy balance, is recognized and communicated within the body via our hormonal system. And so that really was, for me, something that I wanted to emphasize for the summer video series, were researchers that were at the forefront of understanding how our lifestyle, which contributes to all these things and in other ways as well, how that is really critical for a healthy aging process. So before I get into the summary of the videos, I do want to present a set of disclaimers. And this set of disclaimers, especially with topics that relate to people's health, I think are important to keep in mind. And that is, what I'll be talking about today, this is science. And science is always our current state of understanding some sort of cause and effect. Now, the value of the scientific process and the scientific community is that these are very refined, substantiated, credible, peer-reviewed, confirmed over time sets of understandings of these. So in terms of understanding the truth of a matter, I think this is a very good system for coming close to that. But these are always things, a reminder, these are always things that are in process. Your speaker has a limited level of authority on this topic, and I'm not trained in medicine. So these are things to keep in mind in terms of how we contextualize what I say, that I have the professional advantages and skill sets of critically analyzing this material, of being able to understand and read it, but there's a reminder that I'm not a specific authority in the specific field. I'm a science communicator. And the other thing to keep in mind always about science is that there's a vast, and like I'm saying in an allegory, a potentially mirage-laden valley between lab biology and human medicine, human physiology in practice. And a reminder that this is in many ways what we'll be talking about. While many researchers are working within the human systems to understand the final therapeutic interventions, some of the science and the basis of some of those human interventions is based on things that we've learned outside of that type of system. So sometimes there can be situations that are misled. And another reminder too is that given the topic, there's a lot of money to be made. And that more than half the speakers that I'll be talking about, while again, let me say, I think they're presenting and have done very good science, almost all of them have some sort of financial or professional stake in this area on which they speak. I do want to say that's not an indictment. I think that they are doing very good science, but a reminder that even within the realm of science, one can betray certain biases about how you think about the way the field should move forward, because again, not every scientist can do everything. And so that sometimes people have lanes that help inform how they think about these things. So with that being said, the first couple talks were on trying to emphasize this idea of what are some of the basic chemistry aspects of what our systems are in terms of aging. And the first talk was one of many people who performed this rather, you might think of it as a bit macabre experiment of actually stitching together the blood systems of an old mice and a young mice. And so they do this and actually measure the aging effects, where they do see that the older mice will de-age and become more robust like a younger mouse. And then Sinclair is talking about, again, much of the emphasis was on this idea of what cellular aging is, but with an understanding that by introducing certain chemicals and nutrients into the body from our diet, we can actually influence that that basic process that affects the whole organism. And so these are the types of experiments where how we understand age and how we can measure it gives us some hope and idea that you can actually reverse the aging clock, or at least improve our bodies to mimic that of a younger individual. The second week, we covered a video by Nir Barzali, and he is a researcher who's done quite a lot of work trying to understand the genetics of aging, such that if you understand that there's a population of people who live to a very old age, you can look at what their genetics, how that might be different than the general population genetics, and potentially can inform how the aging process is different for different people. And he's also someone who's very interested in trying to design interventions for this. And in some of the terms of some of the genes that he's discovered that are relevant for this, those actually do correlate with some of the other research we found. So again, a very interesting topic of understanding, again, not just to say some people are different than others, but to really understand how, over time, those can be informative for therapies for everyone. Another one of my favorite speakers in this area, Vera Gorbanova, she talked about the comparison of different mammalian species to humans, and to try and understand the if there's anything insightful about those other organisms. She talked about whales as well as bats, that basically when you examine their cellular biology and examine how well they repair DNA, or how well or how much expression of, say, hyaluronic acid they have, that this can show differences in aging. Now, if you take some of those interventions and put those into human cells, make human cells more like whale cells with their DNA repair, that they become improved. And that's what this is an excerpt of her from her talk, showing that that larger blue column shows an increase or a better DNA repair efficiency for the whale as compared to humans, cows, or mice. So again, this is very informative for understanding how we understand aging and where there might be interventions for that. Going back to lifestyle predominantly, Gary Small is someone who has analyzed and studied aging in different populations in the world. And so a topic you might have heard in the space is something called the Mediterranean diet. And again, let me just ask real quickly, anybody here following the Mediterranean diet or have cookbooks that try and, as much as you can in your life, try and follow the Mediterranean diet? Mentions olive oil, which is probably a key component of that diet. But it also not just has to do with the types of foods you eat, but how much you are eating, how much of it is just processed versus naturally made, how you go about the practice of processing it. And Gary Small has made the argument that there are actually, beyond the Mediterranean, you can find several places that he labels blue zones that have these diets where, in general, you look at the healthiness and the longevity of those populations, and they are quite a bit distinct from the general population. And his argument is that, of course, diet is an important component of healthy aging, but it's something that has to be done consistently throughout your life and on a daily basis. I gave a talk from Peter Attia, whose talk in this particular case is not specifically directed towards the aging process, but makes an interesting point about two things. One, that we may be misunderstanding diabetes, and that it's not that one has too many calories, becomes obese, and then that causes diabetes, but that obesity may be a side effect of poor diet that then is associated with diabetes. And I think the second point to be made about that is that there are times where our understanding, our scientific medical model of how things work can, in cases, be very wrong. And in fact, wrong in a way that's misleading to how we go about trying to intervene with it. And I think that that's a case we made for some of the aging associated pathologies, but maybe even the whole process of aging itself. The next week, we talked to get a little more perspective to the feminine side of things. And that is a research talk by Jennifer Garrison, who has been doing a lot of work in association with an institute called the Buck Institute, whose focus is to make sure that our directed understanding and research is also taking an eye specifically for women. And that is, again, as I mentioned, hormones can be an important differentiator between how we age. And the fact that women, in terms of one gender, have a very specific hormonal differences that are based on the biology of being female in a dimorphic species like ourselves, that can be very distinct and can have very different impacts on interventions and lifestyle than you have in males that have a very specific also set of hormone and developmental cycles. And so she was making the case that in particular, there's been a lot of research that is linking how the menopause process also seems to inform the healthy aging process as well. And so I think that is an area of emphasis that's very important. And then the second talk was Lisa Mosconi. He gave a more specific aspect of aging pathology differences between men and women, focus more on Alzheimer's and how menopause, as you look at older people, older women in terms of their aging, that you can see distinct differences between pre and postmenopausal women in terms of various tests related to brain function. as well as understanding the prevalence of plaques that are also, again, not specifically diagnostic, but are definitely also associated with Alzheimer's disease. And so this is something where, again, I know some other background information I'm not going to talk that I didn't really present, but people have looked at research models with mice and have shown differences between males and females in terms of drug and nutrition and supplementation compounds in terms of the results for that in regards to aging. So again, very important to make sure that this funding is equitable among the two populations. The next week was, again, another focus on brain. And the first talk, I wanted to get away from always focusing on neuropathologies as the focus of aging for the brain. And this was a nice talk by Caitlin Casaletto, who is at University of California, San Francisco. And she has been involved in research that shows having a lifestyle that maintains a reasonable amount of physical activity, a reasonable amount of cognitive exercises, helps maintain brain cognitive function. And so that's the excerpt graph from her talk, is just showing that in terms of looking at the amount of good brain functioning, that if you maintain a high physical activity lifestyle, you have much less impairment in terms of brain assessments. And then the second talk was by Dale Bredesen, who is at UCLA, and his talk was a precision approach to end Alzheimer's disease. And there's some very interesting takeaways from this talk. Is that one, the main concept of what he's doing, and this is something called RECODE, so this is something he's trying to commercialize, but also is going through clinical trials right now, is not just one, but a host of lifestyle, drug, and diagnostic interventions for individuals who are in early stages of Alzheimer's, even late stages. And his claim is that among individuals that they've studied, they've actually been able to reverse the effects of Alzheimer's in various patients. And that's what he presented a bunch of data on. And so that's potentially rather exciting. And the types of interventions he talks about and are part of this program all relate to the things that we talk about intervening with aging processes as well. These are not things that are disconnected from each other, but those interventions all align with this body of research that talks about trying to delay or reverse aging. But the other interesting facet of his talk is a reminder that the vast majority of clinical trials and the way the FDA does regulatory oversight is we typically ask in clinical trials that only one thing be done at a time, that there's only one drug that's being tested, or you're testing an old drug regimen versus a new drug regimen. And so his approach of trying to do more than one intervention that's personalized and tailored to each individual is actually a very interesting break from that type of traditional way of doing regulatory oversight of clinical trials. So we'll see how that comes out. It's interesting, potentially exciting, but I also reminder, I think, to, like I said at the beginning, early stages of understanding how well that works for everyone. And then the last set of talks were a little more technical, I have to admit, but a reminder that there are drug interventions that help with the cellular processes going on in our body related to aging, related to the buildup of unhealthy cell types that are causing and driving aging. And that all the things that we can do from a lifestyle perspective to decrease the buildup of those cells can be important. But it's also a reminder that aging is this consistent and constant buildup of things that promotes some impact on the body as a whole. And then the second talk was some of the more modern, up-to-date data coming from David Sinclair's lab, who's out of Harvard and a big publisher in this field, that they are seeing through very specific fundamental ways of understanding the aging process, how cells age and how that impacts and how you can intervene on the whole body level when you understand that process. And so it's very much a very molecular system, something very important, but does get to what could be the heart of understanding the aging process. And so all the things that we can do in the lifestyle to decrease that genetic instability may be a key part of the work. And he, I think in that talk, and at least another one mentioned at that particular conference, and that's been published since, is that they're still trying to find ways to reverse the aging clock with relatively minimal interventions from the clinic. So, from my own perspective, I think there's still some big questions to be answered when it comes to this field. How much can aging be held at a standstill or beneficial to health span via lifestyle alone? I think the body of work and evidence says, trying to have the best and healthiest diet you can, these are all things that can maintain and give you a good health span, but they're probably insufficient to reverse aging. But how much of it do you actually need? And I think when we have all these conversations about drugs and pharmacological interventions, how much can those medicines actually be helpful and beneficial when you have a lifestyle that's driving aging at an advanced pace? How worthwhile is that or how much do we need to understand that process? And again, these same types of questions come not just to general aging, but also when we think about age-related pathologies like Alzheimer's, cancer, osteoporosis, those types of things. So I think those are big questions that come out of research. And my questions for discussion that hopefully can kick off a nice interplay for all of us. Have we really thought about what happens to society and on a worldwide basis if various interventions, again, a well-defined best diet that people are adhering to, some sort of pharmacological interventions, or the medical or genetic engineering types of experiments and therapies that can be done, what happens if those succeed and give some proportion of society, and who knows whether that's a small, we would hope for it to be a large proportion of society based on the cost. What happens in society if we have this longevity that we can expect of 150 to 200 years? And even if these things are shown to be true and that this potential exists, how much will people and the business environments in which we live actually change on this wide scale basis? What sort of disproportionate advantages can potentially come out? I guess the question also for you, anybody who's ever just tried to diet, right? People have throughout our lifetimes been told, and this is true, that being overweight can be a very dramatic negative impact on your health. How easy has it been for us to diet just based on lifestyle? But then also, how often have people committed to drug regimens and how successful have those been, and how well have you stuck with them? Then how well have you stuck with these things after those drug regimens have stopped? So I would like to open up the discussion here. I hope if anybody has any questions about the videos that we talked about, I would love to hear what other people's perspectives are on these big questions or what's for discussion. Although I do have one little added bit to show at the end. So at some point I will intervene to point something out at the end. So anyway, I want to thank everyone who came and participated every week and provided commentary and their own points of view, things that they've done in their lives related to aging and lifestyle. And with that, I would like to open up the floor. So, as asked, I wish I'd come to the series, but the main question is inflammation always caused by microorganisms? And I think you actually point out a very interesting question that primarily we do think of inflammation, the immune response, as something related to bacteria, maybe nematodes, maybe viruses that infect our body. And that of course is true. And that is a lot of research that people have done, is people have correlated infections to an advancement of Alzheimer's and plaque formation, some of the other brain pathologies. But interestingly, the core idea of inflammation and how it can arrive can come from many sources within the body. And that can include stress. Genomic instability and DNA damage are known to drive inflammation. bad diets, right? If you're eating lots of stuff that is can drive antigen responses, even your diet can be something that causes inflammation in different parts of the body. So probably a system that's primarily adapted as an immune response, but it does have this tendency to respond to other things that are beyond microorganisms. Makes a point. Although the biology of aging process is really important, it needs to go hand in hand with psychological processes, which I think have a huge impact on aging. And I will agree. Let me do one thing to kind of contextualize some of that, which is when we think about some psychological processes and how they impact our health, that actually comes back to what sort of hormonal flows and predilections are happening within any given body. So for example, if you're experiencing high stress, then that can lead to an increase in cortisol, right? So yes, there are things that you think about from a psychological point of view about your place and stuff, but a lot of those can get, I think, as relevant to what I was talking about today as a hormone response. And I have to say, what's actually interesting about some of the psychology these days is that we are now finding ways to measure what's called methylation patterns of stress and anxiety, and we are seeing how those impact people's lifestyles. That there are examples, especially in mice, where if you have a mother during pregnancy that was stressed, you can actually see how that stress creates impacts on the offspring that were in utero that then are tracked throughout life as increasing the aging or increasing anxiety that can lead to premature aging. And so that's important. But one part of the blue zone that was really important is he mentioned psychological health, and maintaining that is really important as a part of what we saw in the blue zones. Mentions processed sugar, and I think it's fair to say, although I'm not familiar with all the literature, so this I don't hold me to this, that in some cases just overloading your body with processed sugar, which is driving insulin responses, is something that can also directly lead to inflammatory responses as well, or something where, in a combination with other things going on in your body, leads to various stresses that can help drive. And I can give an indirect argument for how it relates to genome instability. And so, yeah, processed sugars is something that seems to be very clearly a problem with understanding and impacting aging. Mentions poor dental. Actually, that's, I should have mentioned that already, that people have shown for some time now, I think it's just in the past 20, 25 years, that poor dental hygiene is clearly associated with increases in cardiovascular events. And people were very confused with that for a while. But what they ultimately demonstrated was that if you have really bad gums with lots of microbial infections, then the inflammatory response in your gums, and in some cases, those microorganisms floating throughout your body, can actually have impacts on your heart. And so again, this is another example of a very simple thing to maintain. Again, in a wealthy society and with the availability of toothpaste and toothbrushes and clean water, it's a very simple intervention that you'd want to keep on top of. Mentions that Ellen Lamger has a new book on what she calls mind-body interaction. I'm not familiar with that work, but it's definitely the case that we are understanding a lot more about the feedback mechanisms of the brain with hormones, even things like your spleen, and that those are worthwhile. Sorry, she is now correcting herself, saying the book name is actually The Mindful Body. It says aging, parenthetically, particularly aging well, is a universal life skill, yet it is not something most people learn about globally. Can I address why? I also wonder why there's not more conversation about andropause in men. And so, thanks for the commentary and question. In regard to conversations about healthy lifestyle and healthy diet, I don't know why it's such a hard thing to have a conversation about. I will say a few observations. Is that one, there's lots of information that comes out about what are generally good dietary practices. And we've had in the United States so many times a food pyramid, food, other shapes of foods that recommend how much you have in a given day and how many calories you should or should not have. And again, it's always hard to give people a good general guidance that at the same time they won't rebel against for being too restrictive. And I think that that is a part of human psychology. That is a part of it. But the other thing too, and I've just comes from having watched some documentaries about, say, for example, the public K through 12 school system, that there are times where very strong commercial interest will actually dominate what are nutritional benefits of lunches, school lunches. I think one of the best characterizations of that came from Where Should We Invade Next, which was a documentary by Michael Moore, where he talked about how in French schools, they actually teach like culinary appreciation and culinary habits during school lunchtime. And I think that that would be worth watching. You know, I'm not a human psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't think I'm really exactly prepared to answer your question in that regard, but I think it's important. I mean, I think there's nothing probably more important about getting something to happen than to have, one, the educational opportunity and provision of that by somebody you trust, but then also something that encourages it also from an economic perspective. And I think, again, if you look at the calories that people have available to them in the United States, almost all of the least nutritious calories are also the ones that are least expensive. And so that's another aspect of it that's difficult to deal with. But I think it's a really good topic. And andropause in men, you know, I think a part of it is that it's still a relatively recently scientifically covered topic in terms of how well we do or don't understand it. From what I've seen, there are people who are credible that deny that it is a thing, and yet there are lots of people who are credible who are trying to say it is a thing. So I haven't looked at all of the most recent science on that phenomenon. So I apologize for that, but it's something probably worth looking into and trying to discover more about. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Let me just also, so is popping in some other books and other stuff. If you just do Google searches for the names of any people, some of them you'll find a website that's named after them, right? So Peter Attia has a website, like I think it's peterattia.com. Lisa Mosconi also is the same type of thing. And you can find some very interesting books and other resources. But I think we wanted to have that be a topic for another time, or another set of resources people have available in different places. Again, they also all have a lot of them have podcasts. A lot of them have other social media presences. So I mentioned something that here in the UK, we used to get domestic science lessons, not just cooking, but the nutritional value of foods and having a balanced diet. That sounds great to have, and that sounds strange that you don't have it anymore. But that does seem like the type of thing that, you know, if society values people having health spans, which in theory should decrease the cost of medical interventions. Again, if people like Nuri Barzai's models are correct, let me put on something he said in his talk, which is, when you think about lifespan and health span, that these interventions help with your health span, which is how long in life you spend healthy. But it also does increase your lifespan. But he was making the very particular point that in these long-lived centenarians, they have very low medical bills, medical interventions, and it's very compressed the amount of time they spend at their near end of life in terms of how much medical intervention they need. And so it's not just like, you could imagine a scenario in which people live longer, but then actually because you live longer, you end up spending more per person in your lifetime on medical interventions. But by having the health span, that's actually not true. It's the opposite of the case, is the main model for how this is working out. If that's true, then it's a good investment for people and for governments and societies to encourage good nutrition, to encourage healthy lifestyles, because there's a big return on investment for that type of work. Okay. Sorry. All right. So any other kind of quick personal stories or personal interventions? Otherwise, I'm going to show one more thing, which I think is an interesting point. Yeah, no, Peter Attia's book Outlive is something that I think I've not read yet. I just became acquainted with him in the aging field recently myself. All right, so I have one more slide, and that's this one. Brian Johnson. This is a guy who basically became a self-made millionaire in the tech industry. His companies got bought out. He made hundreds of millions of dollars, and then started to use that money to want to invest in interesting companies that are doing interesting things. But what he finally settled on as his main contribute to society use of his money is to try and become the world record holder for reverse aging. And I didn't even know this until this last week, that there's actually an online list that describes like the Olympics of de-aging. And he is the leader. He's at the top of the leaderboard at the moment. But what he does is he spends right now somewhere around $2 billion a year to get the best science consultants. And again, just to be clear, this is the best science as we understand it for aging. Although I think nothing that I've really read or heard about with him has been backed up by double-blind, large-scale, independently run clinical trials in humans. But I think that's where we are. A lot of the money does go towards how much his health is monitored. So again, all these ways of understanding from an assessment, a diagnostic way of understanding what aging actually is. And he's basically being very public about what it is he does, what his regimens are, and trying to talk about what he does. So here's a quick 2-minute video from his YouTube channel. And I think the question here is, what would you commit? All right, here's somebody who's decided to commit to this, seems to be working. Where would you fall in terms of this?
This one is metformin. This is given typically to diabetics. It's been also taken off-label for longevity purposes. The people who I admired the most did things typically over a multi-decade time frame. People who, in their time and place, they survey the landscape of things that they can do, and they identify the thing that can barely be seen and say, I'm going to try to do that thing. Good. Here comes the scary pictures. I started Braintree when I was 27 years old. I bootstrapped the company for the first 4 years. And we were profitable every month. And then I raised money and we sold it for 800 million. And then I made 300 million of that. At the age of 34, I thought it's time to try to do something meaningful on that kind of multi-decade timescale. My objective with Blueprint is to demonstrate aging escape velocity using the best science, trying to do all the appropriate interventions to neutralize my aging process. 1.8, so even better than last time. So I think my first one was 3.4. A few things have distinguished what I've done to date. As far as I know, I'm the only person that has publicly posted my data. So I'm not saying, here's my protocol and believe me. I'm saying, here's my protocol, here's all my data, and here's what I'm experimenting with next, and here's where I've made mistakes, and here's where I'm trying to fix it. It's really a stacked process of maybe 100 different things I do, because you have to think about the body in its entirety. 118, is that right? Mm-hmm. How the heart ages is different than how the lungs age, and how the lungs age is different than how the brain ages. You have to really think about it from a holistic perspective. So it's the common things like diet and exercise, but it's also a much broader consideration. So I have a team of doctors that I work with, and we just go through this rigorous process of measurement, gold standard science, implementation, measurement. It's produced near perfect health for me. No matter how extreme I've had to be, no matter how eccentric people perceive me to be, because I'm outside the norms, demonstrating that age can be arrested would change everything.
So, interesting, huh? All right, so yeah, I think there's some comments in the local chat about how possible is that even to do. Um, he's a millionaire, and he basically spends all his day. He doesn't need to go to work to earn a living. He doesn't. He has, I think, a teenage son, uh, which he actually apparently borrows plasma from in in his interventions. Um, yeah, so at the same time, I think he's making a very honest attempt to be someone to pioneer in this field for the benefit of everyone to understand this process and potentially find this. And I don't think he has any illusions that the majority of people can in fact do what he does. So any comments or other conversation about like what you'd be willing to do or what you'd be willing to spend or what you think maybe society should spend? Makes the comments. It's always interesting when people use their own body to experiment. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting one too. Let me just give a quick summary. I think as far as what I've read about him, and he has a webpage called Blueprint, which I've not had the chance to really go through all the science. He's taken a lot of these drug interventions. You saw his medicine cabinet, and it's full of the stuff that people talk about, like NMN, metformin, rifampicin, all things that you can get as an off-label anti-aging type of use and get prescribed for you, or it's just not even something that's regulated in that fashion. Mentioned one of the things that we know from the mouse experiments is that you can get plasma from a younger person. He's actually doing it from son. Now, that's actually really smart. There have been examples of people trying to just get random young people's plasma, but there is this possibility, and this is something I think is very true for understanding a lot of the stuff he's doing. There can be very long-term negative effects of getting plasma injected from someone who's not a close relative. And so I think that's a really important thing that you do not want to go out and do, is just start getting plasma from somebody. But, one thing it does argue, and maybe something will happen in the future, and again, if you're really esoteric minded about comic books, they've talked about this in one of the reboots of Superman for Krypton, that if we could make clonal bags of tissue from our own cells that are then grown in vats that can then make our own plasma, and we intervene in a way to keep them young, you actually could have a source of your own non-immunogenic plasma. But I think, let me say, the other larger hope for this, and this is what a lot of researchers are doing, is what they really want to try and discover are what are the key components of plasma that can impart these rejuvenation effects. And there's lots of research in that area. Makes an interesting comment as well, which is he's been boycotting the factory meat industry for 40 years for ethical concerns. And I think that is a very reasonable stance to take. But there actually are, it's very clear from the vast majority of nutritionists that talk about this, is that the amount of protein and amount of meat-based diet we have in general is quite excessive. And there are also other environmental impacts of having that much meat production for the environment, climate change, and all those things across the board. Yeah, so mentions like what I was saying, that the plasma of young people could be tainted invisibly and have bad effects. Again, I think the one thing that's obvious, we know from science, is there can be things that end up being immunogenic, which is to drive an immune response in the recipient's body. And as we know, inflammation is not a good thing. Mentioned something. I've been eating an ethical, high-quality, animal-based diet for several years now, and I'm in the best shape of my life. Prediabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, even depression have all been reversed. I'm 57, and most people think I'm in my 30s. And that's a great story, and I think that, and I totally believe you. From what I've seen, Peter Attia has talked about this as well. That high quality foods, a diet done the right way. I'm also going to assume you do at least some degree of moderate exercise, or maybe some other avoidance of highly processed sugars as a part of that. But people can't reverse prediabetes. I think that's what one of Peter Attia's main points in his talk, but said he himself, even though he is thin, was pre-diabetic, and that is reversible based on diet. Mentions one of the biggest dangers for older people is less bone density, and that can lead to falls. And she asked, has much been done on improving bone density? Adding calcium doesn't do it. Yeah, so I do know there are some clinical trials that look at, I think it's NMN, but it might be things like metformin to look at people with, less dense bones. I don't know if specifically it's people with osteoporosis pathologically or just lower bone density. I'm not as familiar with that research in terms of overall. I can't tell you if there are other interventions going on with bone density. But yeah, calcium's not a matter of it. Again, there are pathologies where you have a dietary or nutritional deficiency, but osteoporosis seems to me it's more of a gene regulation. What is the balance of growing versus dissolving bone in the body? That is a little bit off, and that's more the problem. That actually mentions this. Again, I'm not familiar with this, but I'll take his word for it that calcium can make bone more brittle and dense. And that could be something that if your body thinks you have lots of calcium in it, it may be thinking it's leaching off the bone. And so it says, hey, we need to have less calcium in bone, but that's because it's getting an artificial wrong signal, and that's how it normally responds. Again, I don't know if that's true, but that would be a scenario in which you can imagine the intervention itself contributes to worse disease outcomes. I'm sorry, I did have a mention. He said, I had a fatty liver and inflammation too. I am disabled, so low exercise, but I don't do processed sugars or food. So that's all a highly smart and recommended set of things to do. Mentions, I reversed my mom's type 2 diabetes by switching her to a plant-based diet and taking her off of sugar and wheat, all simple carbs. Yeah, that also makes sense. I think, oddly enough, our evolution has really not included simple carbohydrates or refined sugars. And so some people talk about trying to, what's it called, the caveman diet, or paleo, eating paleo, that's right. And the concept behind that does make sense, is that if we have evolved in a way in which our body's expecting certain nutrients and process those, that there's a lot of sensibility to that. I think the other problem though with paleo is that there's a lot of, you don't even cook the meat, which I'm also not sure is necessarily the best outcome these days either. Follows up by saying she lost 120 pounds and no longer needs insulin. So that's great. Yeah, I mean, type 2 diabetes is reversible with lifestyle interventions. You do not have to take, I mean, I don't know what percentage of the case this is the case, but there are definitely cases where lifestyle interventions consistently held to, maintained, can reverse those effects. Oh, and also says, I don't take any supplements or medications, and I'm not a drinker or smoker. Oh, wait, sorry, which reminds me, I'm sorry, I have to apologize. There was a comment where someone said something about alcohol earlier on, and I said I would answer that or respond to it. I mean, I think what we know about alcohol, especially as it may influence things like NAD or energy metabolism, or how the liver responds to it, there's very little recommended. There really is. Now, in terms of how impactful it is compared to other dietary things, I don't know. But it's definitely very clear that alcohol, because it's something you need to detoxify, and NAD is something that's at the core of that, it's probably something that can really dramatically throw off energy metabolism. But the other thing we also know about it is that because your body will take those calories and think of itself as in more of a keto or excess dietary fat metabolism, can actually, that's what leads to cirrhosis of the liver. Once you start impacting your liver in an extremely negative sense, there's not a lot of coming back to that. So I hope that answers the question. I can't actually find the text of that scrolling back, but if you want more about that. Mentions and posts a link to a story about type 2 diabetes drug metformin possibly having anti-aging qualities. And yes, metformin is probably one of the longest well-known drugs where they look at anti-aging effects. They've seen these effects in C. elegans, they've seen them in mice. There are things that have been done in clinical trials in humans that show it to be having anti-aging qualities. And that, yeah, I think it was one of these ones where it originally was designed to be a type 2 diabetes drug. But the problem with metformin, again, I just want to point out, there have been lots of examples where people look at the long-term intake of metformin. And one reason it's not used as an anti-diabetes drug is because there are negative health effects from taking it. Although again, I don't know what the current state of the art, what the current dosing and recommendations are for all of it. Okay, so I'm gonna. Okay, so mentions again. This is worth mentioning. NMN and metformin in low doses or something. I guess he takes, as well as resveratrol. Started calcium AKG recently. I don't actually know what that last one is, but these are drugs that. Let me put it this way: we have lots of good clinical data to say they're helpful. We have lots of scientific models to say they're very helpful for anti-aging and can be helpful. It's just not clear from double-blind, large-scale clinical trials how helpful they are. But they all seem to have been shown through definitely phase 1 clinical trials to have extremely low side effects. NMN is something you can take at a 5 grams per day dose without any observable negative side effects. What is the place of alcohol in optimal diet? Does that depend on one's genetics? Let me answer the second one first, which is to just say really quickly, there are populations, particularly coming out of Asia, that have very strong negative reactions to alcohol, because in those cases, they actually process the alcohol much faster. Their genetics, their alcohol dehydrogenase 2, might be alcohol dehydrogenase 1. Very rapidly processes it into compounds that our body reacts to, including formic acid. So that aside, in terms of the rest of the population, as far as I can tell, alcohol is something, probably an overall healthy diet swamps out small amounts or moderate amount effects of it. But when you look at the epidemiology where people go back and forth. So again, another way to approach this is just to do large-scale epidemiology, food surveys, and compare that to people's health, how long they live, what they die from. So there's been a lot of studies. And when you think about alcohol, when you think about coffee, people go back and forth as to whether they're beneficial or whether they're bad for you. And so it's hard to give any sort of conclusive answer. So, but I think that also kind of says something too, is that if you look at it from that perspective, that there's so much back and forth science, it probably means that at the scale at which most people are having it, it's not a dramatic disadvantage, dramatic negative side effect either. Mentioned something, this is just most recent comment, bread does not agree with her. And that's something to keep in mind, is that bread from paleo times is very different than bread now. Bread now has a lot of gluten, so it can be a good binding agent. We've bred it to be that way. But there may be other things that are going on that's different. And so I know in the food industry, they're all about trying to uncover whether there are extra allergens that we don't even know about or are unaware of from wheat-based products. But they're also highly processed. Are you probably having highly processed bread? Have you actually compared to flour that comes from sorghum? Have you compared to relatively unprocessed wheat? These are the different types of questions one can pursue about how that happens. Asked me to talk more about NMN, and what NMN is at its core a precursor to NAD in the body, and NAD is used for so many things, including DNA repair, for transcriptional, or basically that coding, that information that tells the cell what it is, the methylation patterns, and reestablishing those. And then also at the core of understanding our energy balance, that all of these mouse and other models is that having an increased amount of NMN is incredibly beneficial as an anti-aging in all sorts of cellular models, mouse models. But, and here's the but, it's not clear how much of it that when we take it as a pill, that actually gets into our bloodstream, into our brain cells, into our muscle cells. There's lots of data saying you can see increases in blood levels or blood cell levels of NAD and metabolism when you take NMN. But it's also unclear how much that really gets into the other key tissues. On the other hand, when you look at the whole organism in human trials, you do see benefits. So, but NMN really comes down to this core idea of increasing a key metabolite that's at the crux of genome instability, inflammation, and epigenetic transcription chromatin modifiers of the cell. And people see different things with it. But there's a lot of science. There's, again, a lot of science that backs up its value. He has a really great last question. And tagging onto it, and it's included, so I'll include both of it as a double question answer. So asks, what about calorie restriction? There's a lot of evidence it can extend lifespan. And I think, David Sinclair, someone who's really gone on a lot about this, is that when you look at calorie restriction in various animals, and again, a lot of this field really started with demonstrating that calorie restriction in the nematode C. elegans, which is a science lab organism, that's actually what kicked off this field, is that calorie restriction was shown to enhance their lifespan. And that's really the start of all this in many ways. So the answer is it's hard to say. So definitely David Sinclair has shown and demonstrated that when you look at calorie restricted animals, you see increased levels of NAD. And so, like I said, we know that increased NAD is beneficial to a lot of things that drive, or is beneficial to being anti-aging at the cellular level. By the same token, when you think about calorie restriction, if you're focusing on calories that are, you're basically the percentage of your diet that's the better nutritious stuff, at least in things like mice, humans, and C. elegans, you're also limiting the amount of like extra sugars that you have too, right? So, when you talk about calorie restriction being an intervention, it's very hard to say in all cases exactly what is driving the health benefit of it. It could be something that has to do with hormone levels. But when we come back to think about metformin, rapamycin, so there's this gene called mTOR, that when we think about these energy balance aspects of organisms and their hormone levels, all these things like metformin and rapamycin that have interventions, they may be working through a calorie restriction model. And so the idea of doing things like intermittent fasting, which is maybe helping reset hormone levels, maybe giving you boosts of NAD because your body's seeing yourself at a low food intake, a calorie restriction that leads to your body is something that leads to your body saying, let's have higher levels of NAD. These are things that all seem to be beneficial. I think the important thing to look at in terms of calorie restriction is that, in a lot of cases, you need to have pretty extreme calorie restrictions in humans to show the benefits. You may not have necessarily the right genetics that takes advantage of calorie restriction. I've seen some studies about that. Same thing is true for intermittent fasting. And it's really important to find and this is probably something that ultimately needs to be personalized in a sense, that intermittent fasting may be something that's very personalized to different people. And there's still lots of ways of understanding, should you intermittent fast from evening to morning, or should it be from morning to evening? How many days a week should you do it? These are all really hard things to understand. Another oddball aspect of it too is that intermittent fasting is really important for helping reset circadian clocks. And something we haven't even talked about at all is this interplay between circadian rhythms and diet and metabolism and these things too. So, there are lots of ways to think about, but all the science points to calorie restriction and intermittent fasting done right, where we may or may not know how it's exactly done right for each person. There are distinct benefits for that health-wise, and that's been demonstrated, I think, in multiple tests. So, yeah. All right, so I think that was a good wrap up last question. And I'll just give a summary statement that the science is out there, and it probably has been for some time, that we know there are at least a minimum of some things that can improve our health spans that are relatively low means of accomplishing this. But you would need to do them consistently, and that's something that helps you. Where the science leads us, we don't know. It can probably find an optimal way of decreasing of aging, but maybe getting better than what we're doing now and good enough is a better benefit than trying to find the perfect and optimal thing right now. And keep an eye out. I would say do keep an eye out for those things that do become scientifically demonstrated and provable, that are things that are as simple as a pill or as simple as, an injection, be something that ultimately doctors will be informed to recommend and provide guidance on. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their attendance, for their discussion topics, for coming along. Think about what are the things that you can start doing that's beneficial to you, beneficial to your health, and hopefully also decrease your medical bills in the long run. All right, thanks everyone for coming. I wish everyone a good day.